Hello, my name's Alison Cleary. I'm the Executive Director of Open House Melbourne. Welcome to my home office, unusual places in unusual times. Before I introduce today's Heritage Address, I wish to acknowledge that our programming exists on what always was and always will be, the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people in the wider Melbourne community and beyond. Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia, and we try to be mindful of this in everything we do, given our focus on the modern built environment. And now to today's Heritage Address. Victoria has a rich and diverse heritage, from the grandeur of Flinders Street Station to the scenic landscapes of the Great Ocean Road, the rustic craftsmanship of the Murtoa stick sheds, through to sideless modernist mastery at 1 Spring Street in the city. There are more than 2,400 state significant heritage places and objects on the Victorian Heritage Register. These places and objects all contribute to the rich fabric of our state. Today's Heritage Address is delivered as a partnership with the Heritage Council of Victoria. The Council, as many of you will know, recognises, protects and celebrates Victoria's cultural heritage. They advise the government and others on how to conserve and protect historically important objects and places for the enjoyment of current and future generations. The Heritage Address is an annual favourite on the Open House Melbourne July program calendar. Since 2009, a broad range of people have given their views on heritage in our state and city. The Council themselves have been an avid supporter and advocate for Open House since our inception in 2008, and it's a partnership that we celebrate again here today. And now, today's speaker, Stuart Harrison. Stuart is the host of Restoration Australia on ABC TV. He's also a practicing architect and has worked across architectural practice, teaching and media for 20 years. He's an amazing advocate for good design and the reuse of buildings, and he believes in a strong link between history and contemporary practice. Stuart's the director of Harrison & White Architects. He's worked extensively in public radio and architectural history, and he's published 3 books on housing. I think you're going to really enjoy Stuart's talk tonight. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks for having me as part of both Open House Melbourne and, of course, this Heritage Council address in what's a reasonably difficult time here in Melbourne. So I'm Stuart Harrison. I'm going to talk through recent adventures in television and how that relates to my understanding of heritage and design, what the opportunities that this creates are. So this first slide here, you can see the title of the talk, Heritage Design and Layering. And layering is a particular way in which I think we can approach some interesting questions around restoration or conservation more generally. So I am the host of Restoration Australia for 2 seasons, Season 2, which aired last year, and Season 3, which is airing later this year, around October, hopefully. And this is made by Fremantle Media for ABC Television. And this title slide here from the show, and I'll be showing a few grabs from the show, as well as some of my own photos and those of others, is really a kind of very traditional idea of what you might imagine by restoration, a kind of country property, idyllically lit in the Australian outback. Ironically, this is one of the houses that didn't end up making it onto the show, but it does kind of capture something about the typical way we might associate restoration. What I'm going to show tonight, to some extent, is ways in which we can redefine, hopefully, what we mean by restoration or heritage more generally, what the opportunities are for design, and what some of the pitfalls of formats like this are, and some of the great benefits. So there's a few questions I want to propose in this talk. What does heritage look like is one of them. And what are we restoring when we talk about restoration or a show like Restoration Australia? And what do we need to be careful of? But by way of introduction, I'll introduce myself in terms of what I do. I'm a practicing architect and relatively recently was involved in a big collaboration in central Melbourne, the RMIT New Academic Street project with 5 practices. And this in many ways was a kind of example of a heritage project in a very broad sense. Existing buildings that weren't heritage listed, but very actively used, and a reimagining of them at the lower levels. These are buildings 10, 12 and 14 at RMIT's city campus. And what the team did here was really look at what opportunities these existing buildings had to be opened up, to have better urban outcomes, better interior outcomes, and a more layered approach to history, a kind of episodic series of moments, a diversity model. That was the Bowen Street side, and this is an image here on the Swanston-Franklin Street corner, which my office worked on closely, as well as one of the new laneways that connected spaces together. A lot of things were exposed as they were found. And so what we were looking at here is kind of broad ideas around conservation in some ways, demolition, reuse, adaptability, etc. So what does heritage look like? It looks, in this case, like something not that you might normally expect with that kind of world. But onto the TV show. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and that project that we just saw is a good example of it, is this idea of elective heritage, which is where you choose to keep an existing building when there is no, say, for example, historical significance, heritage listing or heritage overlay. So there's not a thing compelling you to keep it. And what's interesting about season 2 of Restoration Australia, the first one I hosted, was that in fact the majority of those projects, and you can see a snapshot of them here, were in fact elective heritage projects to some extent. People had chosen to keep these buildings, they didn't have to. And that's in fact a really interesting moment. And it opens up one of the questions I want to tease out in this talk, which is what are the pathways to heritage that aren't just about having to keep a building for heritage control reasons? Why might you choose to keep a building? Onto the very direct experience of the television show here, we can see the 6 episodes of season 2. They're on iView, or at least they were very recently, last week. So they're available to be watched. And it's worth mentioning at this point that the next 2 seasons of the show, beyond season 3, are currently in the early development and early shooting stages and casting stages. So if you are interested in having a project on the show, albeit with a different host in the future, you can go to the link at the bottom there and find out more. But on to this next slide, one of the things I want to talk about, and I've talked a lot about to the people I've worked with on the TV show, producers, etc., is the Borough Charter, because it really is the answer to this question: is what is the best practice in restoration projects or conservation more broadly? Conservation is the term we should probably use. Conservation Australia or Adaptive Reuse Australia, Alterations and Additions Australia could all be equally valid titles for the show. But the answer to this question is, of course, the Borough Charter. For those of you who work in the heritage space or have you be familiar with this document, practicing architects will come across it as well, and historians, which is where I first came across it. But the Borough Charter is a consensus document really on how we do conservation in Australia. First written in 1979 in the town of Borough in South Australia. The document really seeks to set a roadmap for how you might approach conservation and the different ways to do it. This next slide shows some text extracts from the document that I've pulled out here and highlighted some key terms: conservation, restoration, reconstruction, and we'll see an example of that. Adaptation, one of those as well. Also highlighted here is this idea of reversibility. It's really important in the Borough Charter, in the conservation world. How do you undo things if necessary? Demolition, we saw an example of that before, a very valid process. But also this idea in clause 22.2, this idea of new work, and that it should be readily identifiable as such. From all this, if you want to do a crude reduction of the Borough Charter, you could say that the new should be different to the old. And this is one of the kind of lessons that I try to take to people working on the show and families and clients, owners of the properties that we're dealing with. And a good example of that is the first of these projects I'll talk a bit about, which is the Hunting Ground project in Tasmania. Christie Borough Architects did the design work on this, and this is a really clear example of new elements, this link in the middle, and existing elements which have been restored, and in certain areas new elements being added on, replaced like for like this sort of gal roof here. This project is a very interesting one. This is a drone shot from the meet and greet, which is the first time the host meets the owners and set out their plans. You can see it's actually two separate buildings, and the proposition here was to join them together to make a bigger one. And what was created was this very clearly delineated room in the middle that used as an entry space and flexible space, but also framed a wonderful view in both directions up and down the Jordan Valley. We can see here a floor plan by the architect who unfortunately wasn't featured in this show, and brings into question some of the bigger issues around attribution that these kind of shows deal with. Often the architect is not featured, though we have examples where they are, and landscape architects, but sometimes it's seen as being a bit too complicated, unfortunately, and the motivations are often seen as coming from the owners or was directed themselves, when sometimes they actually have quite a bit of help. This really should be sorted out, and people should be attributed correctly. So this drawing here by the architect involved in the project, Christie, you can see the scheme, central space in the middle, which is both a deck and a kind of glazed room, and then the existing cottage is repurposed. We can see also here a couple of shots inside the central link space. One on the left there, a bit of a quick introduction to the idea of what a film crew on a show like this is, which is super minimal, really pared back as much as possible. The show is not expensive to make in itself, but it takes an enormous amount of time because we're dealing with real-world projects, often multiple years. So what we see there is a sound operator, a camera operator, and an episode producer. And I'm doing a piece to camera there, which is the camera pointing at me. So that's kind of what I would often see. And then on the left there, in the same space when it's completed, what you as the viewer see, what we all see, which is the finished product here, nicely framed at a low level, showing the sort of glass. And we talked a lot about glass in this episode. And here I am with the lovely clients, Dale and Michael, for the final visit, which is the reveal, a sort of commonly used term these days, as we talk about the finished outcome and their journey, ups and downs, to get to it. And I guess from my point of view, what I'm interested in, what are the design moments? And really, the way all this glued together with this link was really the central part of the design discussion. One more shot of the lovely Jordan Valley here. Again, this is shooting a little piece, but also reminds me that there's certain things that the show doesn't end up covering that it probably should. Indigenous history, which is pretty complex down in Tasmania. So the show never necessarily does a great job of all these histories, and a layered approach to history, more sort of rigorously looked at, would be able to allow for these, I think, more appropriately. So, as I alluded to before, I'm interested in this question of what are the other reasons for promoting the reuse of buildings, especially when you don't necessarily have to. So some of those reasons might be sustainability. The most sustainable thing you can do with the building is reuse it. Authenticity. There's a certain level of convincingness of a building that's already there, but it can, of course, be reinvented. Layering and a sense of place. So all of these things, and this really could be extended to landscape as well. So these are some of the benefits of reusing buildings, in relation to this idea of kind of electing to choose to keep them. A more, traditional project in some ways, closer to a restoration, I guess, is this one at Tatachilla in the wonderful McLaren Vale in South Australia. This is a bit more kind of quintessential Restoration Australia or similar shows to it. So it's a series of buildings there. You can see those two buildings are stables and a Pica's cottage. Again, a drone shot. This is from the This is from the meet and greet of the project. And we filmed this a few years ago. These are my photographs from on the ground, sort of midway during the process. We can see on the left, actually recently in this photo, restored and reused the pickers' cottages into 2 little B&Bs, which you can rent should you need some accommodation in the McLaren Vale and stay with the next door to the wonderful Johnny and Anne. And over on the right side, we can see the main stables building. So this was originally used as part of the agricultural use. And what we can see in this next series of slides is a couple of moments from this show that were quite instructive, I think, and where the show was potentially pretty useful to the owners. They had some very limited architectural design advice early on, which they departed from. So there was no active architects involved in this project. So this was an episode where I was able to sort of give a bit of unsolicited advice, and some of that was taken up with some okay outcomes. So one of them was a discussion around these beams running through the main space that needed to be inserted. And the clients were keen to box them out in timber to make it look like the timber of the original wonderful trusses that are there, and I recommended against that. Boxing out, of course, makes things bigger, and you get into this thing what I was calling the imitation game, and you don't have new from old, you have new trying to look like old, and that's not good practice and ends up just looking very clunky. So we were able to suggest that they paint these new steel elements black and let them coexist. So you get a sort of layering. And that's what happened. And in fact, the outcome of this was really wonderful. Wonderful clients who worked really hard. And down the bottom here, another little moment where on the meet and greet, I'm walking through and there's a blocked out window that's got a very high sill height that you can't see out of. They weren't sure what to do with it. They were worried about overlooking into a neighbouring property. I encouraged sort of lifting the floor level up so that sill became something you could view out of and making the most of it. Was a north-facing window. And they did that, and wonderfully they now get a nice view across vineyards, the sort of thing you might want in the McLaren Vale. So a sense of real achievement here in terms of actually helping positively in terms of design advice in a heritage context. So on this issue of, I guess, design, one of the questions I'd also like to ask is, can heritage practice be a way of promoting good design? I think what I'm trying to suggest with this talk is yes. And why is good design important? There's a bit of writing on this these days, but good design is linked to, improved outcomes in a variety of building types, well-being, performance, all those sort of things in workplaces. So good design is kind of essential, and there is research that makes it clear that good design actually saves money over time as well. So I'm going to use this next project in Victoria to talk a bit about quite a design-led process. So this project is in Frankston South here in Melbourne. It was known as the Jack Clark House. It was an early Hopkins-Clark project from the 60s. And the architect for the reworking of it was Martin Architects. And we can see here a drone shot from the meet and greet. We're sitting on the edge of a sealed up swimming pool that was ultimately demolished. There's a story arc around that in the episode. And here we had a really good story, I thought, because we had a young couple, so not, quintessential sort of an older couple who are deciding to keep a modernist house in the suburbs rather than knocking it down and replacing it or with a big house or subdividing it. And so these were really noble aims. And so this was really being driven by a great attitude. You can see the sort of high amenity of the surrounding area that was created through this suburban context, lots of tree planting. And we were able to talk quite a bit about modernism and the importance of gardens and outdoors and landscape more generally. So in some ways, this project was about kind of what you do and what you don't do. So here's a drone shot from the reveal. Landscape has literally just gone in here. It's now more wonderfully established. But there was a sense here of actually what was already there was actually really good. But there were some significant design changes, and I'll touch on those in a minute. One of the tensions on this project, sort of interestingly enough, was that the owners were doing everything right. They had a good, clear intent about what they wanted to do. They interviewed architects, they picked a good architect, they had a realistic budget, they engaged a good landscape architect in Simone Bliss, and ended up with a really good outcome. And a TV producer is always looking for those moments of conflict and crisis and despair. And to a large extent, they didn't happen, but I was keen to sort of suggest, well, actually, it would be good to have an episode where kind of things go right. There were a few little dramas and a few concerns, not without merit, around how much change was happening, particularly in the bedroom wing. But in the end, we had something that reinforced, or in some ways finished, the original building, made it better. The point is made by the architect in this project that, the materials used here weren't necessarily designed to last forever. The fundamentals of the house were good. The design moves, that connection with outdoors, and actually a wonderfully generous connection to the street, which I find incredibly refreshing in a world obsessed with fencing and fortressing. These are some of the more beautifully composed photographs of the completed project. We can see here a completely rethought kitchen area, and it now opens substantially up onto a north-facing pergola. So it actually, really does a great job of being both the original house and a contemporary intervention in this sort of layered way. And in some ways, the new and old here are a little bit blended, which I think is interesting. And again, in very good hands, that's an approach that can be really supported. So I want to come now to this idea of conservation and, I guess, conservatism. And I've sort of alluded to this, but interesting, this question about whether conservation is fundamentally conservative, or at least sometimes, and whether it needs to be. What are the motivations behind conservation? And I'm going to use this next project, which is quite contentious, as a way of talking to this. This project is known as the Gas Regulating House, or Gasworks, I think, on the show in North Melbourne. The architects were Multiplicity and A Wonderful Landscape by Mel Ogden. This obviously is a bit of historical context here. This is the former Gasworks site next to Arden Street, North Melbourne Football Club's home ground. And the gasometer, which you can see there, very dominant in the cultural memory of North Melbourne football fans, demolished some time ago, even though it's the most significant feature. And then what's right next to it, and you can see in both these images quite small, is the sort of infrastructure that supported that, which was actually quite finely detailed classical building. And so the owners of this show purchased a portion of that, which was in this condition when they purchased it, and then sought to kind of work out how to reinvent it. This image here is slightly deceptive because originally this building was full of gas pumping equipment. It was actually essentially a very attractive shell to a industrial use. It had become a kind of a combination of uses over time. But the clients purchased this, and the TV show became involved as well to follow the story of them converting this. And I thought this was an exciting opportunity to talk about adaptive reuse, another valid form of conservation, how you change use and you do modifications to support that new use and respect the heritage fabric. And so, and it was quite a design-focused design project. We can see here in this wonderful Emma Cross photograph the insertions made into this space. Controversially, the pod in the middle caused a lot of consternation at the time, maybe still does. But you still get a sense of this complete room and these elements slotted into it. So this, a principle of removability, new, different from old, is all very clear. And a really strong sense of layering and spatial definition in really interesting ways. The sort of downside of this was that it was seemed to attract quite a lot of negative attention, and what you might associate with a conservative group of people around sort of civility were reasonably aggressive in their commentary, and this was quite distressing to both the owners and architects and others involved in the production, and was taken very seriously. And it made me think around whether all of this was worth it, and whether this was a good opportunity to actually talk about design. TV producers like to push people into particular stereotypes and And so there was a bit too much of that going on. So in the end, I'm not sure this episode was successful from a design advocacy point of view. It seemed to polarize everybody into their sort of biases. And I don't know if we won many people over in terms of adaptive reuse as a valid process. A lot of people ask me what I think about this project personally. I thought it was incredibly well handled and adventurous, and it's essentially what the clients had asked for. And this, in fact, was a heritage context. There was a heritage listing on this building, only on the exterior. Despite that, the design fully respects the interior skin of the space. And I wrote a little bit about this episode in particular, as well as some other elements of the TV show, in a piece I wrote for Arctic Victoria a year or so ago. And this talk builds on some of the things I was talking here. You can get that online. And this was an excellent issue that it was in, edited by Harriet Edquist, one of my former lecturers at RMIT, called Citing Heritage. And some contemporary ideas of heritage and restoration are encapsulated in this piece. So if you want to find out more, you can always look this up. And the final slide on this project here, the full title of which, from a multiplicity point of view, is Classical Gas, the original stereo version, which was received an award in the Arctic Awards last year. A couple of drawings here showing that layout in its entirety and the way in which that central element works, offset pod element. But also one of the things I want to touch on was the wonderful Mel Ogden courtyard. Very harsh conditions there, contaminated soil. But also what we're doing here, it's me taking a photograph of a little drinks we have at the end of a reveal shoot, which are filmed often. And a good way to kind of get everyone together and try and break down some of the sort of barriers between, I guess, TV production, either side of the sort of the narrative, and something that's worked to reasonable success on most of the episodes. I want to talk a bit about this project now in Western Australia, which is the Pagannon House, which was actually the first episode of Series 2. It's a very important one for me, one close to my heart, and was really, in fact, to be honest, one of the reasons I decided to ultimately agree to do the show was to get the story of this architect more widely known. This was, of course, designed by Ivan Ivanoff, who did a wonderful series of projects in Perth, mainly houses. Reasonably well known in Perth for many years in the wider community, but not known nationally. And so this project now, which was a reconstruction following a fire, is really dated both from 1965 when Ivan Ivanoff finished it, and then Tim Wright, Perth architect, who headed up the new work. And the new work was substantial. This wasn't a restoration, this was a reconstruction effectively. And here we are at the meet and greet, a drone shot here, a well-publicised fire in local media and a bit of national media, architectural media, reported on this, I think in 2015, gutting out the building completely, which was a total work of art type of project. And here we are walking around what's left of the suspended floor slab. There's a little garage tucked underneath there that was relatively untouched, and trying to rework out how this house worked and beginning to talk about, the enormous task of reconstructing this. And there was a really interesting story here around archive material, archive drawings, family photographs that were all used, magazine photographs, original photographs. Really good detective work on behalf of the wonderful clients, Tim and Lisa, to try and literally piece this back together. And of course, it was a success story. The house was completed. Here's a shot also at the meet and greet, looking straight through the house, or what was left of it, this platform, to the park opposite. And this reminds me just how great this house was, even in the end, of having this sense of throughness, this kind of amenity on both sides, garden, front garden, park. And really one of the things that was so exciting to me about this project is, even though it's a 60s house, the lessons here in terms of design advocacy are equally as important as they ever were. So This project was interesting because a full reconstruction, i.e. just bringing it back to how it was, is in itself a design advocacy project, because it was almost a perfect house, and it is again. All of those kind of modernist things that we touched on a bit in the previous one of access to outside, amenity, light, cross ventilation, the fundamentals that we've lost in Australian housing. And as someone who used to live in Perth, important lessons that need to be relearned. And this is the completed veranda, which is really central to the whole experience of this space, this threshold. Looking back, it's got these wonderful stone arches, and there's a good story on sourcing stone. Pagan, the original owner, was a stone and laminate merchant, and Ivanov just sort of ate that up, just used these wonderful materials that he had access to, both traditional materials like Italian marble, but new materials like laminate. There was some beautifully painful work to restore laminate to how it was done. It's not done anymore in that way, with the sort of thin black kind of line edgings as surfaces meet. Really interesting work, and it was a great pleasure to me to be involved in this project, and very touching to see these people back in their homes. And so the design advocacy story here, which is sort of my interest, is this project is reconstructed. The way a TV producer looks at this is quite different. They're involved really in the personal story of the project. Both can work and coexist. Both, in fact, can be layered. The remnants of some drinks there from the end of the shoot on that celebrated bar, and that's some of that restored laminate I was just alluding to. And then after these drinks, going back outside, I hadn't actually seen this project at night either, recently, or indeed in its heyday when I used to live in Perth and I knew this house as an architecture student in Perth. But it was this wonderful coloured lantern and rich, deep, layered series of colours, and not minimalist at all this rich material, but all this rich light. A really wonderful project brought back to life, and almost a sort of public building in some ways in Perth's cultural memory. So very satisfying to see that completed, and a real highlight for me. And this episode really is the benchmark for all the work we've done on the show, both in terms of the story, the way it's shot, the way it looks, and probably my enthusiasm for it. So I want to come on to one of these other questions I want to touch on, which is, how do we layer the past with our contemporary understanding of place? I guess this is a way of talking about that we can never go back to the past, and we probably don't want to. So we always see things through our contemporary understanding, and our contemporary understanding of place and occupation is quite different. And that needs to be evident. And I think, we need to, and that's a way of celebrating new elements as well into a project. And so if we look at the Pagan house, for example, that we just saw, that house has been reconstructed now, and that is always part of its history. It is not now a 1965 house. It's a 1965 house and a 2018 house, and that's now part of its story. But I actually wanted to stay in Perth for a minute, which is a place very close to my heart, and talk a bit about this idea of layering in an evident urban form, in a historical way, around relatively recently completed public realm project Cathedral Square and Perth City Library, the library by Carey Hill architects, late Perth architect, but also this idea really about the other buildings in this image, the wonderful 1896 Titles Office by George Temple Poole, the St George's Cathedral in the middle there, and probably, for me, most significantly, Hallett Bailey's Council House at the back of that image. Now this series of buildings talking to each other, all at different important moments in a place's history. So Perth, in some way, in terms of its European settlement at least, you get a sense of its history laid out for you in a space like this. And this project was a really great piece of urban design to increase the prominence of the Titles House, which has a wonderful enormous facade on its side, effectively. And the new library is a great piece of contemporary public architecture, municipal architecture as well, for local government. Rare to see such a great, highly valued piece of design commissioned by local government. But I do want to just talk a bit about that building in the background, Council House. And 1962, Halton Valley, wonderful Fritz Koss photograph of it here, this kind of beacon summarising the optimism of Perth at the time. But, 1950s, 1960s Perth is a double-edged sword. Optimism, growth, but also, this was not necessarily great times socially for a lot of people. Indigenous people weren't allowed in central Perth. A lot of other well-documented issues. So we do need to be careful when we're celebrating these periods, and that's why this layered approach can be quite good. But one of the layers of this particular building's history is its almost demolition in 1994, which is when I first became involved in the building's history, because it's part of my history as an architecture student and activist and advocate. And I participated in a student protest, student-led protest to protest the demolition of this building. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes advocacy work going on at the same time by people like Geoffrey London, which ultimately led to the saving of the building. Here I'm capturing it in some of my photographs at the time. Emptied out, it is having its asbestos removed. It actually had this wonderful transparency there, and when looked at from a different point of view, capturing light and becoming quite solid. You can see the hoarding around the base of it there. And really what was happening here was another kind of misunderstanding about history that was happening at the level of the government. The state government at the time was very uncomfortable about these Perth landmarks. This building was almost demolished. Other buildings were being talked about demolished, and some other ones were, that represented that time of the 50s and 60s. Because it was seen as being not what the aspiration of Perth was, which was really to try and re-establish it as a colonial city. So in that image you saw before, the kind of St George's Cathedral version of Perth, not with these contemporary things that had been added on. And there was a very clear link between the social values of colonial Perth with what the proposed cultural values were of the time, or trying to get back to. This was quite a conservative dalliance that was occurring at the time, and for good, this project was retained. That government moved on, and there's a good story here, which is Perth Council House was retained, and indeed a few years later it was celebrated on a series of Australia Post stamps on architecture. One of four buildings pictured on these stamps. One of the others, of course, was the Opera House. Some pretty good company. So good story. Another beautiful photograph from the 60s there. So I've elaborated on this a little bit already, but one of the sort of things I would propose here is that we should consider the social values of the time of a building's original construction and moments in its history. So in regards to that previous example in Perth, these things are political, and we've seen a real flare-up of this idea recently. So when we propose a particular type of building in terms of its era and restoration and celebration, what comes with that, and how do we deal with that? How do we interpret that history in a positive way that acknowledges the darkness of our history? So why are we restoring is the thing I would ask us to think about when we come to do this work, because it does come with a political angle, but also is full of opportunities. Talking of which, here's a little sneak preview of Season 3 of Restoration Australia that will hopefully air later this year. And in some ways, Season 3, as you can probably get a sense here, probably returns to some of the more traditional forms that you might associate with this show for whatever reason, progress, time. A lot of the more 19th century projects will end up in this next series, and you get a bit of a sense of that. Here's 3 of what will be 7 or 8 projects that will be in the next season. Well, thank you for joining me in this difficult time. I would encourage you to look at the back catalogue of the Heritage Address, particularly recent ones, Kirsten Thompson, Tim Ross, as they talk through their experiences and their ways of understanding this space. Thank you.